Welcome to Hawk Talks Alumni Career Spotlights hosted by the Career Development Center and Alumni Relations. My name is Bella Kokoza and I'm a political science major at SJU graduating this May. I'm also the Human Resources intern at the Career Development Center and I will be moderating today's session. Throughout this series, we've invited alumni to join us for conversations about their careers in order to give you insight into different career paths, industries, and to get advice on how to enter and thrive in these fields. These sessions will be recorded. Our guest today is Samantha Koch. Welcome, Samantha. Samantha graduated from SJU in 2011 as a political science major. She is currently working as a senior project manager at PA Commission on Crime and Delinquency. She has previously worked in policy roles that have focused on education and workforce development within the Governor Policy Office and the Pennsylvania Department of Education. Within these roles, Samantha has a particular focus on enhancing school and campus safety through policies that address issues like gender-based violence, harassment, and discrimination. While at SJU, Samantha was involved in the Hawk Student Newspaper, Office of Residence Life, and the Political Science Honor Society. We are so excited to welcome Samantha back to Hawk Hill and to hear her story. I have a list of 10 questions I will be asking you today, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A from our listeners. Audience, please feel free to write your questions in the chat box that will be shared with our guests during the Q&A at the end of the session. All right, let's get started. We're going to begin with a series of career-focused questions, the first being, could you please describe within your current role the core responsibilities and what a typical workday or week looks like for you?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be with you all. And it's funny, as you were listing out what I was involved in St. Joe's, my goodness, yes, I was involved in all of those things and look back very fondly on my time at Hawk Hill. I actually was reminded by one of my friends who graduated with me that coming up on May, it will be 10 whole years, so a whole decade since I left, which is pretty hard to believe. So anyway, happy to be here. So to your question about my current role, so I work as a senior project manager at PCCD is what we call it. And so, you know, I served in a variety of policy roles, as you mentioned, in state government, and obviously worked in the nonprofit sector before that. So in my current role, it's sort of a blend of policy and project management. So I support a number of different initiatives, both within our agency as well as programs and projects that are happening with our sister agencies and with other partners across the Commonwealth. So, you know, that's kind of a cool role for me. Before, I was very much focused just kind of on the policy work. This is sort of allowing me to be in a project management function as well. So it was funny, as I was looking at the word typical, honestly, days and weeks haven't felt very typical in the last year. I'm sure you guys feel the same, but usually I'll start my weeks just by kind of sketching out what are some of the projects that I need to accomplish or make progress on in the week ahead. My days usually start with really enormous cups of coffee, and then just, you know, sort of taking a look at my to-do list, catching up on some reading, tackling my inbox, those types of things. So I usually throughout the day am either facilitating or participating in a couple of different meetings or phone calls. And so, you know, usually I'll just kind of work to support different types of groups that are getting together to talk about different issues. So that's me in a nutshell in terms of what I do currently. Happy to dive into more specifics, but I do wear a lot of hats, which is both exciting and also sometimes challenging. It means you're constantly pivoting from one topic to another, sometimes within the hour. So yeah, that's me and my role.
Great, thank you, Samantha. Can't wait to hear some more. When did you know that this was the career path that you wanted to pursue, and what led you to this decision?
Yeah, so I was definitely not one of those students. I had a lot of friends who were at St. Joe's who knew exactly what they wanted to do. They enrolled in a specific major because they had a career and a profession in mind. That was not really my pathway. I was pretty undecided. I knew what I was interested in learning about. I loved politics and policy, so political science was kind of a natural fit for me from that perspective, but I wasn't really sure what that major would necessarily translate to in terms of an endpoint. Ever since I was young, I've always been an avid reader. I love writing, pulling together different information and analyzing it. And I was that nerd in your projects who always wanted to like build the PowerPoint. So from that perspective, I knew the kind of work that I liked to do, but I just wasn't exactly sure what that would translate into. So fortunately, while I was at St. Joe's, I was able to explore a lot of really valuable professions and pathways, whether that was sort of part-time jobs or internships or student activities, even research projects, quite honestly. I think that's one of the things I love about the political science department, at least when I was there. I'm sure it's still the same. They really challenge you to dig in and do a lot of different work on very different topics and aspects of policy. So that was a really helpful way for me to kind of navigate and figure out, okay, here are some environments and places and projects and areas that I feel like are a good fit. I feel kind of comfortable, but also challenged. And then, honestly, some of them were not great experiences. And so it also taught me kind of just as important is knowing what is not a good fit for you and really isn't your cup of tea, even if that might be kind of on paper a really traditional pathway for a student who has your set of experiences or your set of sort of skill sets. So, I appreciated all of those different experiences, and I've loved every single job that I've had, some more than others. And I've appreciated all the different parts of the work I've been able to do since I left St. Joe's. I think for me, it really clicked. I felt like when I came into a policy analyst role about 6 years ago with the Pennsylvania Department of Ed, I really felt like I was able to patch together all of those different experiences and interests that really just, for me, it just felt really natural. It was the kind of work that I didn't know that I could do professionally, but once I was in it, it felt like it made sense. So I used to joke, my family is mostly teachers and nurses and folks who are in traditional business roles. So to be honest, I spent a lot of my time when I first joined state government explaining to relatives, what it was that I actually did. And I would usually just describe that I basically read a lot of information. I try to gather information from different experts around different topics and synthesize that into a shorter form for folks who are trying to make a decision. So it's basically book reports, so to speak, for people who are really important and have to make often difficult decisions, in consultation with others around really important issues. So I play a small role by kind of synthesizing what options are on the table, what are some pros and cons of such things. So I love that work. I've always loved kind of asking folks who know a whole lot about different topics, different questions about what they think on certain things. And so policy definitely allows you to learn from really important and interesting people and try to get to some consensus around improving communities. So so that's sort of when I knew. I will be honest, career path feels like a much more intentional thing than what I ended up doing, but things sort of clicked along the way, I guess.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's also great to hear that all of the reading that the poli-sci majors are doing in undergrad is paying off those reading guides. The professors aren't lying when they say you're going to get a stack of papers and you're going to have to write a one-page report on what you just read 500 pages on. So that is very nice to hear. My next question is, what is a typical career path for an entry-level associate within your organization?
Yeah, so I would say, in state government in general, so my agency, PCCD, we serve as a criminal justice agency, so we do policy and planning work within the executive branch. Where I started was the Department of Education, so they're the state education agency. So I think, if you're thinking about state level government and public service at that level, entry points can vary. Most people who are working in state government take the path of civil service. So there's sort of a kind of career pathway that folks have to enter, and then you kind of go through different stages. I've always been in a political appointee role, and so that's a little bit different. it tends to be a little bit more flexible. What I would say is, generally speaking, a lot of folks who come to those positions tend to be folks who have experience working on political campaigns or working in community-based mobilizing or grassroots organizing. So a lot serve in the nonprofit sector or think tank. So it really depends on kind of which type of role you're looking for. But those are some, I would say, common entry points.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. My next question is, what do you enjoy the most about your profession, and what is something that you wish you could change?
Well, I mean, I love this work. It is, I would say, both the things that I love and the things that can sometimes be challenging are sort of, the things you would expect within a political environment, right? So I love the fact that, we all come around the table and try to make the world a little bit of a better place in some way, or we try to tackle really challenging but important problems and come to some solutions. So that's amazing to be able to work with folks who are kind of sharing that same goal, who certainly come to the work wanting to make a difference. That's one of the things I love most about it. I think certainly, I talked about policy options, right, and presenting different strategies. I think that there are many different opinions and many different perspectives on what the right or the good or the best way to do things might look like. And so even if you have folks around the table who agree that there's a problem that needs solving, the mechanisms to get there and the values that feed into that equation look very different for different people. And I say it's a double-edged sword. I love that, and it can be frustrating. I think it's important to listen to folks who don't always have the same life experiences, worldview, vantage points that you do. It can be challenging because it often means that they're not necessarily going to immediately agree with or think that what you're putting forth is sort of the right way to do things. But I think I've learned early on, it's not so much about the right choice or the right option. It's really about how you get to consensus. And I think that process of getting groups of folks together who may have very different starting points and getting them to a place where they can agree on something. I don't think it's what you tend to hear about when you hear government, but I really do feel like that's something that happens pretty routinely, and it's really where the magic is, for me at least, is seeing folks kind of come together around things that we can get done. So I hope that answered your question. It's a little bit of both, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of going off that, what surprised you the most about your career?
I shared with my friend that I have a career. Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's so cool that I get to do. I'm amazingly aware of how it's just rare to be able to get paid for work that you enjoy. Work is still work, right? So there are some days where it's more fun than others, but I think it's very surprising to me. If you had told me 10 years ago when I was still a student that I would be able to wake up each day and do work that is meaningful, is engaging, really makes me feel challenged and excited to kind of get started, and that I also wasn't having to live in my parents' house because I couldn't pay for anything. I mean, that ability to build both a rewarding and a sustainable career in terms of just, being able to grow and sort of branch out on my own. That was really important to me as a student, but to be honest, I didn't think it was possible to both do good and also be able to sort of build a life. So it is possible. I got a lot of good advice along the way, but I will say, I think I was very skeptical of it when folks gave it to me back a couple of years ago that was really possible. So yeah, that's probably what has pleasantly surprised me the most about my journey.
Oh, that's awesome to hear. That's so nice that you have such a passion for your work and it doesn't even feel like work. So now I'd like to shift gears to focus on action students need to take. I would also like to remind our listeners to post any questions you have in the chat, and they'll be shared during the Q&A. All right, so I'm going to ask you about internships in a moment, but for now, what 2 to 3 experiences would you suggest that students engage in while in college to help them prepare for entering this field upon graduation?
Well, you already said finished all your reading, which
Yeah.
I'm sure your professors will love. I think really, there's formal opportunities. We'll talk about internships in a little bit, but I would just say, generally speaking, a couple of experiences. I would try to pay attention to what's happening on campus in your community and get involved in things that you care about. So you can try to find opportunities to sort of learn about things you may not be as familiar with, and maybe connect with people or places that present some different points of view. So I think sort of, lifting yourselves out and figuring out, okay, what's going on around me is a really good and important experience. I think, the other piece that I mentioned before, this idea of exploring a lot of different workplaces, or not even a formal workplace, just places where work is getting done, so that you can get a feel for the type of work that you like doing, the types of environments where you feel like you can be supported and also successful, and paying attention to kind of that gut feeling that you get when you're doing something. Does this feel right? Is this something that kind of clicks for you? And then I would say too, we talked about coursework. I think one of the great things about St. Joe's is that even though I was a political science major, I also had to take, at the time I didn't think it was great, but I had to take a lot of other coursework that wasn't necessarily interesting to me at the time. But what it did was, it really allowed me to learn, okay, here's how you digest new information. Here's the different languages, so to speak, that are in this sort of sector versus the other. And it really gave me an ability, and I'm sure for my advice would be for you all as well, to sort of digest a lot of information and figure out what's relevant, where are there connections to other concepts or disciplines, and just understanding that there's different ways to kind of frame and experience, the same set of problems.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thanks, Samantha. You touched upon this a bit before, so I don't want to force you to answer this again. But how did your SJU education impact your work and/or the career decisions you've made to date?
Yeah, well, very much so. I think, one of the first things when I got to campus, I had always been interested in politics and concepts of public service. I have a really annoying obsession with concepts of fairness and justice, but I was not really very familiar with concepts of social justice. And so my time on campus really taught me pretty early on about, those phrases that are on flags all over campus, right? Cura personalis, care of the whole person, these concepts of dignity, and making sure that when you talk about justice, it's not just, what's right and wrong. It's about, how people are treated and the expectations that they should have for living in a fair and just society. So I really appreciate, that sort of informal learning opportunity. I'm sure it was in a course catalog somewhere, but I feel like I learned those concepts from my peers and from folks who were working on campus, and just that was sort of a constant flow in the background for me. And I would say, we talked on the liberal arts education piece, right? This idea that you have to take philosophy courses and theology and all sorts of other things. I do really think that ability to connect different ways of thinking and seeing the world, it really gives you a set of transferable skills and just an ability to kind of understand that there's different ways to approach things that I think is really valuable. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say, the small environment at St. Joe's, and particularly in the political science department, that ability to know your faculty and to build relationships and have mentors, and also, the friendships and peer relationships that you build along the way. Those have been tremendous influences at every single stage of my career. I know that I can pick up the phone or talk to, Dr. Baglioni, or a lot of other people who are just able to give me really good advice and help me to kind of figure out if there's something that is a good next step for me or what I should be thinking about. So as a student who came from a really large public high school and was a very shy, introverted person, I just remember feeling like I could come into my own at St. Joe's because there was a whole bunch of people who were ready to support me and meet me where I was at the time. So I'm really, really grateful for that. And I think that's what I'm most fond of when I look back and think about my time on Hawk Hill.
Yeah, that's so great to hear. Dr. B is the absolute best. Definitely a fan
Yeah,
favorite
she's
in the
amazing.
poli-sci department. I have her on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so I'll have to tell her that
Nice.
I talked with you. So moving on to internships now, what types of internships should students try to secure to prepare for a role like yours or within your industry?
Yeah, well, Bella, you could probably speak to this too, since you had an internship with a lieutenant governor. But yeah, I mean, I will say, in terms of my internship pathway, so I had internships. My very first one was in my sophomore year with a nonprofit organization in Philadelphia. So that was kind of my entry point into learning about the nonprofit world and figuring out all the different ways that they get funding. And anyway, so I was in kind of the development office, which is fundraising office, and I was able to learn how to do grant writing and all sorts of experiences that I still do today, which is kind of cool. I also did internships for a communications firm, so that sort of intersection between public relations and policy and advocacy. And I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple along the way, but I had a number of unpaid internships as well as part-time jobs. I will say too, I think, I don't know if it's changed over the last decade. I remember when I was a student, there was so much emphasis on, getting the right internship, and it's okay if it's unpaid, and trying to like scrape together dollars to just, make it to a SEPTA train to be able to get into Center City. So it was a very stressful experience. I remember just feeling like I needed to find exactly the right thing that would then turn into a career. And like I said before, I mean, all of those experiences were fantastic. I got something from each of them. And sometimes what I got was, on paper, this sounded like exactly the type of work that I thought I would like doing. And then once I got there, it really wasn't what excited me, or it didn't turn out exactly the way that I expected. So what I would say is I don't think there's a wrong way to start. Certainly working in spaces where organizations are trying to listen to communities, help identify some problems and some proposed solutions, whether that's a nonprofit or a campaign, or some agency, either at the local level or state level, or in DC. I know there's a really great DC internship option, which I did not participate in, but a lot of my peers did and had nothing but fabulous things to say. So what I would definitely suggest is working closely with faculty and with other folks who have gone through those programs, and just get a sense of, hey, here's what was good, here's what was bad, and then go from there.
Great, thank you. I completely agree with everything you just said. Wonderful advice for our students. So as we come to a close to the first part of this session, I have two final questions for you. The first is, what is something that you wish someone told you when you were in school? And what is a piece of advice you would give to students interested in a similar career path?
Yeah, probably for what someone should have told me when I was in school, and I know people did, was, sleep more and, take a breather. It's okay. Yeah, I think everything felt very urgent when I was a student, and some days I kind of missed that. It's sort of just, I think, something that happens when you're on campus. But yeah, everything felt very urgent. I felt like I needed to do everything all at once. On the career side, I felt like I needed to pack in as much as I could within 24 hours. And so looking back, I joked with my friend last night that I feel like I may have just been chronically sleep deprived my entire 4 years at St. Joe's. So, and not even for particularly fun reasons all the time either. So definitely sleeping more, taking care of yourself, figuring out a balance and where there's boundaries. Those are lessons that I learned a little bit further into my 20s that I wish I had learned a little bit earlier. In terms of the advice I would give to others who are interested in that path, beyond make sure you sleep and take care of yourself and set good boundaries. I mentioned this before. I was really conflicted, particularly my senior year, with trying to figure out a pathway. What am I going to do after graduation? And I remember, having a lot of friends who were in the business school, and they had all in the summers of their junior year already gotten their placements, and they weren't even interviewing anymore. And I just remember feeling completely frazzled. I remember sitting at my parents' kitchen and trying to apply for like the 300th job during winter break and just feeling completely like it was a futile process, right? And so, I think the thing I sort of reflect on is that at the time it felt like everybody was just so much further ahead in figuring out that next step. And, things come together. And so it may not feel like it at the time. When I graduated, the job market was still recovering from the Great Recession. And I just remember feeling like there was always this tension of being able to kind of pay your bills and have just some sense of financial security. St. Joe's is a wonderful place, but it is not a cheap place. And so I just remember feeling very sort of nervous that I wouldn't be able to have a career path where I felt good about the work I was doing. I could sleep well at night now that I finally wanted to get 8 hours of sleep, and then also be able to, branch out and have my own sort of, life outside of my parents' house. Not that they're not wonderful people, but I just remember really wanting to not have to be living with my parents. And so, I think the advice I would give is just, even if things feel a little futile, just be patient. The process works the way it works. Check in with people who know you and who care about you and who are sort of able to look above and sort of see where your path might lead, and trust their advice, but also just trust your gut. There are going to be some times where I know for me in my last semester of senior year, I remember having a couple of job offers on the table. And that was it was a good position to be in because it's nice to have job offers. But I just remember feeling very conflicted about, if I pick the wrong one, will this mean that the rest of my path is sort of fixed? And so what I would say is, take whatever the first step is that feels right for you, and just know that it's okay. You're going to be able to move and pivot and, do something different if you need to. You're not kind of stuck in that first place that you land in. I feel like I talk to a lot of students. I don't know if that's how folks feel still, but I know that's one of the questions I get a lot from students who are in their senior year, is just this concern that if they pick the wrong thing, or where they start with their first job is going to somehow dictate the rest of their path. And for me, that really hasn't been the case. It certainly shaped my path in good ways, but I've never felt kind of stuck or forced to go in one specific direction based on where I started.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Samantha. Now we're going to transition into the Q&A portion of the session. My colleague Noelle from the Career Development Center is going to address the questions that students have entered into the chat box, which I don't think anyone has entered questions, so please do so now. I actually have a question for you, Samantha. With being so busy with work, what does your work-life balance look like, and what do you do when you're not working?
Oh, that's a great question. So I have gotten better. I think I talked about boundaries. If you had asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have been like, what personal life? But I think in quarantine, I have learned many new skills, which have been exciting. I feel like I'm finally a competent cook. I used to always be a fabulous baker, and I still love baking. It's sort of my stress release. And when I was working in person in the office, it would often be a way for me to sort of incentivize or encourage colleagues. I sort of promised to bake them their favorite treat if they did something. So other than setting up a carbohydrate bribery system, I've gotten into running, which is fun. When I was in high school, I was really active into soccer and sports, and I sort of let that fade. So it's been fun to get back into movement. And then at one point I was like an art school hopeful. And so for me, painting and doing some art is always something that I enjoy, as well as going outside with friends and loved ones. So yeah, when I can, I'm definitely looking forward. I love traveling and going different places. And obviously that hasn't been as possible in the last year. So I'm really looking forward to hopefully having that be in my future again in the next couple of months.
Yeah, thanks. That sounds like a great balance. I know that there are still no questions in the chat, which is disappointing. Come on, guys. But I think Noelle had, I think Noelle had a question for you.
Yeah, so are there any new skills or things you've had to learn and implement over this time, especially since COVID started? Anything you can touch upon in that regard?
Oh yeah. I mean, what I would say, one of the skills, I don't know if somebody has been through a strategic planning process. That feels like if someone had told me that when I was a student, I'd be like, what is that? But I've been through that with a couple different organizations that I've worked through. It usually involves like your team or leadership kind of going off into a room or off site for a full day, and they come out of the smoke of that process, and they have a mission statement. And anyway, I was asked at the very start of us working from home, we knew we had to undertake a strategic planning process. And so our executive director asked me to do a project plan with the assumption that we would be working remotely. And so in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of adjusting everybody's work styles, we basically had to transition to a fully virtual strategic planning process. And that involved doing a lot of project planning, facilitating large groups of staff virtually in teams around specific deliverables. So I had certainly had experience facilitating groups in in-person settings, and I had had some experience with virtual, but my goodness, I got very well practiced at that over the last year. So it ended well. Our strategic plan was adopted unanimously back in December by our commission. It was a great work product, but yeah, figuring out how to kind of schedule what's too long for a virtual meeting. I mean, I feel like people check out after 20 minutes or so, and just figuring out kind of how to structure and pace the work in that setting was really a good learning experience for me.
Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, it's definitely been a tough time for a lot of people and a lot of companies and organizations. So we've all had to sort of been flexible and adjusting to this new environment of work on Zoom and everything. So it's interesting to hear another perspective about that as well. Just sort of,
Yeah.
I guess, my own personal question. I know you talked about your career and, where you are now and how you got there. But curious, like, where do you see yourself, in the next 5 years as, for students who don't really necessarily know what their plan is going to be and, what they want to do? What would you give advice to a student right now of like, where do I see myself even right now that I'm fully developed in my career?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of nice. I really love where I'm at right now. And so I feel like when I was in my early stages of the career, it really was about kind of looking to the next step. And it was always kind of what's that next thing and kind of going upwards. So I'm really enjoying the fact that I'm in a place right now where it's really good and interesting work. I work with a great group of people. So I don't have a good answer for that right now, but I am confident that if something were to change or if I would feel like I would need kind of a next step, I've honestly sort of in the back of my head always wondered about, should I go back to grad school? Those types of kind of eternal questions, right? But I think to me, I would be interested in continuing to be able to work on policy issues that I really care about, and be able to support people and communities who are making that work happen at the ground level. I think one of the at least for me, when you think about kind of traditional policy careers, there tends to be an assumption that the closer you get to Washington, right, the more important that work gets. I've really enjoyed being able to stay a little bit closer to where policy actually has an impact. And so that's not to downplay the really important work of federal and national policymakers and think tanks. But I feel like for me, I love the fact that when there's a law that passes or there's a program that takes place, you're still close enough to where that's happening that you can talk to and hear from people who are making that work happen on the ground. And so I don't know if that'll change too much for me moving forward. So I think that's been maybe a surprising lesson for me as I've evolved in my career, is just recognizing that I do like to kind of stay a little bit closer to kind of the implementation side of the work than maybe I originally expected.
Thank you. Yeah, that's amazing to hear. It's always reassuring to hear from someone who feels, very comfortable and confident in the career path that they're in right now, and that there's a place for all of us to get there at some point. It's just finding the right path. So thank you.
Yeah.
That was my last question. Bella, do you have anything else that you wanted to ask?
This is kind of like a poli-sci geeking out question, but you mentioned obviously the importance of state and local government, the impact that they have directly on citizens' lives. Did you ever take Professor Powers when you were at St. Joe's? Was he around?
He was, and I never took his class, but he's one of the people I stay in touch with.
Yeah.
So I was much more into the political theory side. I was that person when I was at St. Joe's, and so I did not take state government. I kind of wish I had, right? But yeah, Joe Powers is amazing. We've connected on a couple of different occasions, and he has just such a tremendous insight in terms of how Harrisburg works, how it doesn't sometimes, right? So so I was not fortunate to take his class, but I have very much benefited from his knowledge outside of the classroom.
Yeah, he's definitely a great resource. I've taken 3 of his classes. I'm sad that I couldn't take him my last semester because I think it was Pennsylvania politics, which I had already taken, so couldn't take it again. But yeah, definitely someone to keep in contact with. All of the poli-sci professors, couldn't speak more highly of them.
Yeah.
And clearly you also feel the same.
Yeah, they're amazing. And I would say too, every state's different, right? So I actually grew up in Jersey. And I remember thinking, like, when I moved here to PA permanently, I was like, what do you mean I have to like register my own car and like I can't just drive up to an inspection? I mean, local control is a very real thing. The power of local governments in any state is important, but I think in Pennsylvania, especially as a Commonwealth, counties really drive a tremendous amount of what happens in terms of policy. And so there's a balance. When I was working in education, you learn very quickly that school districts have a lot of autonomy, and so there's sort of a balance of what the state can and should play a role in, and where local government ultimately steps in. So yeah, it's definitely, PA is a really fascinating place. I love New Jersey. I'm an unapologetic Jersey native, but I think from a policy perspective, Pennsylvania is an incredibly interesting place to work.
Definitely. Nobody else has any questions. I guess we will.
Oh, no questions.
Oh. Right. Well, everybody, please join me in thanking Samantha for joining us today and for providing such great insight into her career. Samantha, we are so grateful for your time, and we hope to see you back on Hawk Hill soon. Have a great day, everyone.